How should we, as Catholics, handle the following inquiry?
If certain creation doctrines are not yet formally defined, must I assent to these doctrines?
To answer this question, let us examine a work by Catholic priest Father Giuseppe Frassinetti. The work, written in the 1860s, entitled The Dogmatic Catechism, has a preface written by Archbishop Henry Manning, who would later become a cardinal of the Catholic Church. In the preface, the then Archbishop writes,
I, therefore, very heartily recommend the use of this catechism to the clergy and faithful.
This Archbishop recommends this work, not only for the potentially poorly catechized Catholic faithful, but also for the Catholic clergy. As this short work is to help the Catholic approach doctrine, we also include a quote by Blessed Pope Pius IX. He writes that Father Frassinetti was
a priest excellent in doctrine and virtue.
What an appropriate quote from the Holy Father on the author, Father Frassinetti, who we will look at to orient us on properly understanding Catholic doctrine. Now onwards to Father Frassinetti's Dogmatic Catechism, to help us know, as a Catholic, what must I believe? To answer this, we look to Father Frassinetti's section of his Catholic Catechism, dealing with the theological virtue of faith.
In theology, are those things only certain which the Church has already defined and declared to be of faith? It does not follow that because a truth has not been defined and declared to be of faith, it may be denied with impunity, or at least looked upon as doubtful, but only that he who does not believe it, or doubts it, is not guilty of the sin of heresy, though he may be guilty of the most grievous rashness.
How many times does one hear,
the doctrines of creation have never been formally defined by the Church. Therefore, I am free to believe progressive creation and other forms of theistic evolution.
But Father Frasinetti continues,
before the Council of Trent, certain truths were not defined and declared to be of faith, which in that council were defined and declared to be so, against the novelties of the Protestants. And yet those truths were commonly believed and recognized as certain by Holy Church, and it would have been grave temerity to deny or cast doubt upon them, as Luther and Calvin did.
Although temerity is a word not so widely used today, it means to exhibit boldness, recklessness, or rashness as relates to adhering to doctrine. To add the word grave in front of temerity means the action on the objective level has now become grave sin, or what Catholics identify as mortal sin. To consciously choose to disbelieve such truths is a damnable offense against God and His Church. We continue from the Dogmatic Catechism.
If it were necessary that a truth should be defined and declared to be of faith in order to be certain, it would not be certain that Christ walked upon earth with his feet, such fact having never been defined and declared to be of faith. Hence we clearly perceive that it would be a perverse and unreasonable mode of reasoning for a theologian to argue thus. It is not defined and declared to be of faith that in hell there is material fire, that the contracting parties are the ministers of the sacrament of matrimony, that the Pope is infallible when he speaks ex cathedra and is superior to a general council. Therefore all these things may be denied or regarded as doubtful. A theologian who should reason in this manner would err grievously, for although these truths have not been defined and declared as of faith, they are commonly believed and recognized as certain by the Church.
If it were necessary that a truth should be defined and declared to be of faith, in order to be certain and required belief, why practice any of the following? Praying the rosary, even once during your life. Wearing the scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Going to monthly confession, or even confession once every 6 months. Receiving Holy Communion once a week, or even once a month. Wearing, using, or distributing St. Benedict medals, miraculous medals, etc. Engaging in 30 minutes of spiritual reading daily, or just even 15 minutes of spiritual reading once every year. On and on the list could go. None of the aforementioned devotional practices have been formally defined by the Church as being requirements to be aimed for by Catholics. Yet, what practicing Catholic of goodwill would not pray the rosary daily, or wear the brown scapular, or make use of the sacrament of confession monthly, or even more often, or do their best to receive weekly, if not daily, Holy Communion? To support this source of Father Frassinetti, we add one short citation from a work from 1946. This work, Questions of Catholics Answered by Father Herbst, gives another reminder that there are truths of the Catholic faith that demand our firm assent, even though these truths are not formally defined. Father Herbst states,
The Church teaches that in addition to the pain of loss, which is a negative punishment, there is also a positive punishment, the pain of sense, commonly referred to as hellfire. The reality of hellfire as an instrument of the sense of pain has never been solemnly defined as an article of faith, though it is said that if the Vatican Council had not been interrupted, it would have been so defined. But meanwhile, it is clear that no one may doubt the reality of hellfire without grievous sin. It would not be formal heresy to deny it, but willful error and temerity, and no Catholic can deny it without grave sin against the faith.
Although our purpose here is not to contemplate hell, we'll save that for your upcoming Ignatian retreat, but rather to consider that there are multiple truths of the faith that you cannot deny without major culpability on your part. Even if that culpability was only a venial sin, one would not want to assent in opposition to the Church. However, this potential for grave sin, or mortal sin, should clearly be enough to elicit the quick and solid assent of our intellect to doctrines that have such universal teaching as the Catholic doctrines of creation. It should be out of a simple desire for docility to all that Christ and His Church teaches that one should want to assent to the many teachings and doctrines of the Church on creation. In addressing the sins that flow from the forgetfulness of these Catholic doctrines of creation, we continue here by turning to the words of Father Faber. We quote from his book, The Creator and the Creature.
Forgetfulness of God has been in all ages the grand evil of the world, a forgetfulness contrary to reason, and so opposed also to the daily evidence of the senses, that it can be accounted for on no other hypothesis than that of original sin and the mystery of the fall.
Let us in turn not forget the error and sin of turning from truths of the faith, even if not formally defined. The evil of forgetting the different truths that are contained in the Catholic doctrines of creation. Worldview that is acquired by assenting to the truth and reality that flows from these creation doctrines only further offends God and works for the ruin of souls. Continuing with the question on what must be believed for the Catholic of goodwill, we look at several paragraphs from Father Denzinger's work, The Sources of Catholic Dogma. The paragraphs are from Pope Pius IX in his apostolic letter Tuas Libenter. This letter from December 21st, 1863, rebuked the erroneous position of one of the most learned Catholic priests in Europe, Father Dullinger, excommunicated in 1871. It was not only a dogmatic declaration that Father Dullinger defied, but it was also the importance of consistency in doctrine that he challenged. Father Dullinger was definitely a forward-looking and progressive priest, who was a precursor to theistic evolutionists, as he stated.
The Church cannot exist without a forward-looking theology.
And
the method and principles by which the scholastic teachers cultivated theology are not at all adapted to the needs of our age and the progress of the sciences.
As always, the language of adapt, forward-looking, update, renew are in the works of Catholic theologians who desire innovation in doctrine. How many will openly admit that for nearly 1,700 years, the doctrines of creation were consistent and universally held in dealing with instantaneous creation? The ordering of the days, and the God-revealed age of the universe, and then admit, because of the supposed progress of geology and astronomy, that the doctrines of creation must change and adapt. Now onward to the words of the Holy Father, Pope Pius IX, working to protect the flock against the updating and innovation of the likes of Father Dullinger, and easily applicable to the updaters and innovators promoting theistic evolution. Pope Pius IX clearly communicates the perennial teaching of the Church. This teaching is that we are indeed required to assent to many doctrines that are not dogmatically defined, as is stated in the bottom half of paragraph 1683.
For even if it were a matter concerning that subjection which is to be manifested by an act of divine faith, nevertheless, it would not have to be limited to those matters which have been defined by express decrees of the ecumenical councils, or of the Roman pontiffs and of this see, but would have to be extended also to those matters which are handed down as divinely revealed by the ordinary teaching power of the whole Church, spread throughout the world, and therefore, by universal and common consent, are held by Catholic theologians to belong to faith.
This is such a helpful aid in protecting the doctrine of the Church against the progress of doctrine or teaching to a new and updated interpretation. Such innovative interpretation may win the applause of the world, but will not win the graces needed for the salvation of souls. Pope Pius IX continues with the same doctrinal protection for his sheep, where he states in paragraph 1684,
"It is not sufficient for learned Catholics to accept and revere the aforesaid dogmas of the Church, but that it is also necessary to subject themselves to the decisions pertaining to doctrine which are issued by the pontifical congregations, and also to those forms of doctrine which are held by the common and constant consent of Catholics as theological truths and conclusions, so certain that opinions opposed to these same forms of doctrine, although they cannot be called heretical, nevertheless deserve some theological censure."
There are few positions more commonly held and expressed by Catholics for millennia than the perennial Catholic positions on creation. These positions, regarded as sacred history, believed once and always, are not natural scientific conclusions. They are teachings of sacred history, universally held, and are not to progress at the whims of the teachings of fables that are promoted by some, most, or all in any natural scientific field. Many who hold that the Catholic creation doctrines must be discarded due to scientific progress will commonly cite the so-called fundamentalists. However, these Catholic progressives regarding the doctrines of creation need not blame or ridicule the so-called Protestant fundamentalist. The liberal Catholic ridicule and mockery should instead be directed to Pope St. Pius X, who stated in 1907 that the following proposition should be condemned.
Scientific progress demands that the concepts of Christian doctrine concerning God, creation, revelation, the person of the incarnate Word, and redemption be readjusted.
In conclusion, we see from the sources cited that many modern Catholics fall into the following problems when not assenting to doctrines that have been universally taught for millennia. According to the words of Father Frassinetti, Father Herbst, and Pope Pius IX, these problems include the most grievous rashness, grave temerity, to err grievously, grave sin against the faith, theological censure. How often do the words of our Lord Jesus Christ need to be heeded, that indeed the letter killeth, but the Spirit quickeneth? The letter of Catholic dogma must obviously be assented to, but the spirit of the dogma, including much doctrine that is not formally defined, must be fully followed. Grave sin against faith, for following merely the letter, reminds man of his obligations to further the glory of God. And although the laundry list of dogmas is included in this glorification, even while on earth, the spirit of the law of discussing, believing, and teaching the undefined doctrine of God's holy and indefectible Church allows for an effective diffusion of grace to further the salvation of souls.